There is a rock shelter in the Northern Territory of Australia called Madjedbebe. It sits at the edge of Coconino National Park. For decades, it was considered a moderately interesting archaeological site. Not remarkable, not famous. It's not the kind of place that changes everything. Then in 2017, a team of researchers finished dating the sediment layers beneath the shelter floor, and the date they got back stopped the conversation cold. 65,000 years. Human occupation at Madjedbebe going back 65,000 years. 47,000, not 50,000, 65,000. Which meant that Aboriginal Australians had been living on that continent for at least 65,000 years, making them the oldest continuous civilization on Earth by a margin that is not close. It also meant something else, something that the archaeology alone could not prove, but the DNA confirmed 6 years later. The people who sat around fires at Madjedbebe 65,000 years ago did not come from where we thought they came from. They did not travel the route we assumed. And what happened to their population in the tens of thousands of years that followed was far more complex and far more connected to the rest of humanity than anyone had calculated. Let me take you back to what the conventional story was before the DNA work began. The accepted narrative went like this. Modern humans left Africa approximately 70,000 years ago. They moved along the southern coastline of Asia. They reached what is now the Indonesian archipelago. They crossed a stretch of open ocean, the first time any human population had made a deliberate ocean crossing, and arrived in Australia somewhere between 47,000 and 50,000 years ago. They settled. They spread across the continent. They developed cultures and languages and technologies in complete isolation from the rest of the world for the next 47,000 years until Europeans arrived in 1788. That was the story. Clean, linear, simple. The DNA dismantled it piece by piece. The first major crack came in 2011, a study published in Science using genetic samples from Aboriginal Australians collected in the early 20th century before large-scale European admixture. Compared Aboriginal Australian DNA against a global population dataset. What it found was that Aboriginal Australians were not simply descended from the same wave of migrants that populated Europe and Asia. Their genetic signature was distinct, ancient, the analysis suggested. That the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians diverged from the ancestral population that gave rise to all other Nan-African humans approximately 62,000 to 75,000 years ago, before Europeans diverged from Asians. Before the populations that would eventually settle the Americas diverged from East Asian populations, Aboriginal Australians were not a branch of the human family tree that split off late. They were one of the earliest branches. One of the first populations to diverge from the common ancestral pool that left Africa. And they had been in their part of the world continuously for longer than almost any other population on Earth. The 2016 study from the Max Planck Institute and the University of Copenhagen went further. Researchers sequenced 83 Aboriginal Australian and 25 Papuan genomes, the largest genetic study of these populations ever conducted at that point. And what they found inside those genomes answered a question that had been quietly sitting at the edge of Australian archaeology for years. The question of the second wave. Around 4,000 years ago, archaeologists had noted a series of changes in the Australian archaeological record. New stone tool technologies appeared. Dingo, the wild dog, appeared on the continent for the first time. Changes in food processing practices, changes in language distribution. The mainstream explanation had been that these changes were the result of internal development. Innovation within an isolated population. The 2016 genetic study said something different. It identified a clear genetic signature of gene flow into Australia from South Asia, approximately 4,000 years ago. A second wave. Not European, not Southeast Asian, South Asian. People from the Indian subcontinent had reached Australia 4,000 years ago and interbred with the Aboriginal population. Their genetic contribution is visible in modern Aboriginal Australian genomes today, and they probably brought the dingo with them. The continent that was supposed to have been in complete isolation for 47,000 years had received visitors from India 4,000 years ago. The isolation story was not just incomplete, it was wrong. Now here is the layer that the 2023 study published in Nature added. Researchers working with ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains recovered at multiple sites across Australia and Papua New Guinea built the first timeline of internal population movement within the continent. Not just when people arrived, but where they went after arriving and when. And how the populations that are alive today connect to the populations that were alive 10,000 years ago. What the ancient DNA revealed was a pattern of population movement that was far more dynamic than anyone had assumed. The early settlers of Australia did not simply spread across the continent in a wave and stay put. They moved. Repeatedly, population expansions and contractions driven by climate. During the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels dropped dramatically. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania were part of a single landmass called Sahul, and the Ice Age climate compressed habitable zones into refugia, specific regions where water and food were available. Populations contracted into those refugia. Then as the climate warmed, populations expanded outward again. The ancient DNA captured that expansion. It showed that many of the regional populations alive in Australia today descend primarily from populations that expanded out of specific glacial refugia after the last ice age ended approximately 12,000 years ago. Which means that the population structure of Aboriginal Australia today is not a direct continuation of the original founding population. It is the product of a series of climate-driven expansions and contractions across tens of thousands of years. A dynamic, shifting, complex population history that the conventional narrative of simple, continuous occupation had completely missed. The Denisovan finding is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Denisovans were a sister group to Neanderthals, known almost entirely from DNA extracted from a finger bone and 2 teeth found in Denisova cave in Siberia. We know their genome in detail. We know almost nothing about what they looked like or how widely they were distributed. What we do know from modern human population genetics is that Denisovan DNA is present in modern populations, and the population that carries the highest level of Denisovan ancestry on Earth today is not in Siberia. It is not in East Asia, which is closest to where the Denisova cave specimens were found. It is in Aboriginal Australians and Melanesians. Aboriginal Australians carry approximately 3 to 6% Denisovan ancestry in their genomes, higher than any other population on Earth, which means that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians, at some point during their journey from Africa to Australia, encountered and interbred with Denisovans. It's not in Siberia, somewhere in Southeast Asia or the islands of the Indonesian archipelago, in a region where no Denisovan fossil has ever been found, which means Denisovans were present somewhere in Southeast Asia or island Southeast Asia tens of thousands of years ago. We have their DNA in Aboriginal Australian genomes as the only evidence of their presence there. The bones have not been found. The DNA carried forward in the bodies of people whose ancestors crossed to Australia 65,000 years ago is all we have. There is one more finding that needs to be part of this story: the question of languages. Australia has, or had, before European colonization, approximately 250 distinct language groups. 250 languages across one continent. Some of them are so different from each other that linguists have struggled to find common roots. For decades, the linguistic diversity of Aboriginal Australia was used as evidence of the isolation story. A population in complete isolation for 47,000 years would naturally develop extreme linguistic diversity. The DNA study from 2023 complicated that interpretation considerably. If the population of Australia was contracting and expanding, mixing and separating, moving across the continent in response to climate, then the linguistic diversity is not just a product of isolation. It is a product of populations repeatedly separating, losing contact, and independently developing language over tens of thousands of years, only to encounter each other again when the climate shifted and the populations expanded back into contact. The languages carry the memory of separations that the bones and the archaeology could not fully capture. The DNA is just now giving those separations a timeline. Here's what the complete picture looks like when you put it all together. 65,000 years ago, possibly more, a population crossed from Southeast Asia to Sahul. They carried in their genome the evidence of an encounter with Denisovans somewhere along the way. An encounter we cannot place geographically because Denisovan bones have never been found in Southeast Asia, but whose evidence lives on in every Aboriginal Australian alive today. That founding population spread across the continent. They developed into regional populations, with distinct cultures, languages, and technologies. The last ice age compressed them into refugia. The warming climate released them back outward. Their population structure today reflects those expansions, not the founding migration. 4,000 years ago, a connection to South Asia introduced new genetics, new technologies, and possibly the dingo. The isolation story was never the full story. The DNA is the full story, and the full story is not one people arriving and staying put for 65,000 years. It is one of the most complex, dynamic, deep population histories on Earth, a history that the people who lived it encoded in their languages, their oral traditions, their dreamtime stories that describe the flooding of coastlines that occurred at the end of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago. Those stories describe real events that happened so long ago that Western science required DNA and radiocarbon dating to verify them. The Aboriginal Australians knew, they had always known. They just kept the record in a different archive. Subscribe if you want the history that existed long before anyone thought to write it down. I'll see you in the next one.